So my opponent stated that homeschooling is ineffective for K-12 education, and our supporting claims are that parents are unqualified teachers, homeschooling is ineffective for problem children, and that homeschooling does not prepare children for the real world. I'd like to argue that her claim is not proven due to the lack of insufficient evidence to support her claim, and that her reasoning is based on hypotheticals. In her first claim, she states that parents are unqualified teachers. She says that California does not require parents to have a prior education or teaching credentials to teach. She then argues that parents are unqualified because they do not have the necessary education or knowledge to effectively teach their children. To argue, the argument is insufficient in evidence, and there's no data comparing the quality of teaching of homeschooling students and traditionally schooled students. For my research, I found that in the National Home Education Research Institute reports that children who are homeschooled typically score 15 to 30% higher than public school students on the standardized academic achievement test. This means that parents' level of education, this shows that parents homeschooling their children are overwhelmingly outperforming students in public schools. Compared to public schools, majority of parents are providing an appropriate education, which makes them qualified to teach with or without a proper education. This means that the parent's level of education has no relevance on the success of a student being homeschooled. This neglects the claim that there's no correlation between the parent's level of education and their qualifications to homeschool their children. In her second claim, she states that children can be homeschooled or put in independent studies as a last resort. She then inquires that if students cannot perform or behave well in school, that homeschooling as a last resort is not a solution to provide students with an education. The issue with her statement is that it's not a qualified claim, and that also her evidence is insufficient, and then that the statement is also based on hypothetical reasoning. In contrary to my opponent, I'd like to argue that homeschooling can be an effective learning environment for a child with behavior issues. Behavior issues are when a student acts out or has outbursts in class, and behavior problems are also linked to students with ADHD and other disabilities. In a study done by psychologist Peter Gray, he analyzed that a collective group of 26 children diagnosed with ADHD that have been homeschooled. He concluded that children's behavior, mood, and learning generally improved when they stopped traditional schooling, not because their ADHD characteristics vanished, but because they were now put in a situation where they could learn to deal with those characteristics. And the students shown that they were more active and self-directed without being disrupted, and had opportunities to learn to cope with his or her personalities. This shows that placing children in an environment where they can thrive can be fundamental for their learning, and homeschooling is not a last resort for parents to discipline their kids. This evidence proves that it can provide a stable environment for children to actively learn and succeed at their own pace. My opponent's third claim, she states that homeschooled children are sheltered from struggles that they will encounter in adulthood. She stated that some parents homeschool their kids, do not expose them to sex, drugs, or alcohol, which is typical of high school, and she claims that it could be detrimental to when they're to homeschool kids because they're not going to be able to handle these as an adult. This statement is all based on an assumption with no proof that homeschooled kids are not exposed to the real world, and also there's no statistical data that shows proof of that sex, drugs, and alcohol have a positive outcome on kids. I'd like to argue that homeschool kids are provided an education that will prepare them for adulthood. Usually it's thought that homeschool kids lack socialization and exposure to the real world, which prepares them for adulthood, although from Calvert Education on average, homeschoolers participate more in their community, less in sedentary, and socialize with a wide mix of adults. Homeschoolers are also not exposed to peer pressure and bullying, and which is tied to poor academic performance and lower self-esteem. This shows that homeschooled kids are capable of socializing and are more exposed to real-world experiences compared to traditionally homeschooled students. As they grow older, they carry these social skills that prepare them for adulthood. This shows that parents, on average, are more likely to expose their homeschooled children to real-world experiences, which counters the claim that parents try to shelter their kids. This shows that they are not misguided by students that present a bad influence are in fact exposed to people that are model adults. In conclusion, the advocate failed to provide the evidence and presented poor reasoning to back her claim. This disapproves the claim that homeschooling is ineffective for K-12 education.
Okay, it starts off pretty well structured at the beginning. When you get to the first point, it felt like you were previewing all of the individual responses that you're going to give on that first point. That's probably unnecessary. Just make the claims as you go along. That'll be a little bit simpler. You do have a good piece of information about the performance of students who have been homeschooled in comparison to other students. I thought that that was pretty effective at responding on that particular point. And and then you kind of repeat the point again 3 times. And I think you made your point once, and you kind of belabor it a little bit when you were delivering the transition to the second point. When you get to the second point, you basically are talking about why homeschooling might be in fact an effective solution for some kids who have issues, taking kind of a contradictory position to the advocate's point. The advocate is suggesting that it's not a solution, and you don't come right out and say, well, it is a solution, but you do say that some kids with problems would benefit from having a non-traditional way of being educated, and you use the ADHD as an illustration of that. You had a good study that talked about how the students learn differently in those environments, and you, of course, are contrasting it to the lack of evidence that the advocate cited on this particular point. And I thought that that was a good point that you made on several of these issues, where you suggested that the advocate doesn't really provide any way of measuring or evaluating the problems that are being talked about here. On the last point, you'd have a generic piece of information that talks about how homeschoolers are likely to come in, they're more active in their community, they come in contact with more adults, they're less likely to suffer peer pressure and bullying. That's a good generic response on that argument. You do have a tendency to, well, forget the tendency, you just read the whole damn thing, and I think you need to talk to us a little bit. So I appreciate that you were so thoroughly prepared, but don't forget to engage the audience while you're speaking to us, because this is an audience-centered activity, and ignoring the audience is not likely to increase your ethos much. All right, thank you.